HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Aroused, the History of Hormones and How They Control Just About Everything, by Randi Hutter Epstein, M.D. Read by Donna Postel. Introduction. In the summer of 1968, I spent a lot of time at my grandmother's pool, the Sprainbrook Country Club in Yonkers, New York. My grandmother, Martha, and her 3 friends, always the same foursome, sat in the shade, playing canasta, drinking hot coffee, and smoking Kents. I'd swim with my older brother and sister, but mostly my sister and I sunbathed, our bodies slathered in Johnson's baby oil, our heads tucked into the crack of an album cover that we had wrapped in aluminum foil, trying to grab the sun's rays. On the way home, my sister and I would hold our arms side by side. She always had a decent tan. I, a redhead, was consistently the color of a ripe tomato, the kind of burn that peels off the next day. But Grandma Martha was spectacularly bronzed. She seemed to absorb the best rays without even trying. 5 years later, we learned that our grandmother didn't have a particular aptitude for sunbathing. She had a hormone problem, Addison's disease. Her body wasn't producing enough cortisol, a hormone that helps maintain a healthy blood pressure and strengthens the immune system. People with Addison's disease suffer from extreme fatigue, nausea, and low blood pressure, sometimes dangerously low. The disease also darkens skin. Once she was diagnosed, the treatment was easy. She took daily cortisone pills, which contain a hormone chemically similar to cortisol, the one she was missing. When my grandmother was born, in 1900, the word hormone didn't exist. It was coined in 1905. By the time she got sick, in the 1970s, scientists had a way to spot her hormone defect, measure her hormones down to 1/1000th of a gram, and prescribe pills that kept her illness at bay. In 1855, Claude Bernard, a renowned physiologist, had a hunch that the liver had something to do with preventing wild swings in sugar levels in the body. He had been studying digestion and had already discovered that the pancreas releases juices that break down food. To test this, he fed a dog a diet of meat and no sugar. Then he killed it, immediately removed its liver, and tested the still warm organ for sugar. A few minutes later, and again several hours after that. Much to his delight, the sugar level in the dog's liver started at practically 0, but continued to rise. Even though the dog was dead, the liver, as do other organs, kept functioning for a few days. That's why transplants work. Bernard announced to his colleagues that the liver must contain a chemical that stores and produces sugar. But he also proclaimed that all organs, not just the liver and pancreas, release substances that keep the body running smoothly. He called these chemicals internal secretions. It was a new way of thinking about the body. Many historians consider Bernard the father of endocrinology. I don't. The real pioneers recognized that these chemicals aren't just internal secretions. They play a more important role. They arouse. They excite receptors on target cells, flipping switches that get things going. I delved into the history of hormones because the last century has been a period of incredible discovery and also outrageous claims. In the 1920s, the discovery of insulin and its use as a treatment changed diabetes from a death sentence to a chronic disease. In the 1970s, a test for thyroid hormone among newborns prevented thousands of children from growing up intellectually disabled. At the same time, there were wild missteps. Vasectomies were promoted as a treatment to rejuvenate elderly men, a fad that lasted nearly a decade beginning in the mid-1920s. Not long after that, a doctor who treated the literati claimed he could detect hormone ailments by studying people's faces and prescribed hormone-based remedies. It was hocus pocus, combined with potent and potentially dangerous treatments. Aroused tells the stories of daring scientists and also of desperate parents. In the days before sophisticated imaging techniques, an early 20th century neurosurgeon performed brain operations to remove bits of a gland that he thought would staunch diseases caused by an overdose of hormones. In the 1960s, one couple scoured pathology labs and morgues to get growth hormone for their short son. Aroused is also the story of curious shoppers dying, sometimes literally, to tap into the hormone hype in order to live a little longer or feel a little better. I began with doctors in the late 1800s, scrounging the glands of cadavers, some of them stolen from graveyards. I culminate with scientists tracking hormone pathways right down to the genes that make them. How did we discover that growth hormone isn't just for growing? When did we learn that the testes and ovaries are controlled by a hormone in the brain? Does the recently discovered hunger hormone mean it's not really my lack of willpower, but my own chemistry nudging me to binge? And if so, is there really a difference between the two? I am my chemistry, after all. And what do the newest studies say about hormones being used today? The testosterone gels popular among aging men, and hormone replacement therapy for menopausal women. Aroused starts in the prequel to hormones, when 19th century medical practitioners began to eye the chemical-secreting glands scattered throughout the body. That research led to the concept of hormones in the early 1900s. By the 1920s, the field, endocrinology, had exploded from an obscure science to one of the most widely discussed medical specialties. In addition to the discovery of insulin, estrogen and progesterone were isolated. At the same time, advice books flourished, promoting all kinds of wacky remedies. If the Roaring Twenties was endocrinology's coming-out party, the era when it gained popularity for both real and quack cures, the 1930s cemented its role as a serious science. 3 pivotal advances in biochemistry debunked dogma of years past. It had been thought that estrogen and testosterone were wildly different substances, but researchers in this decade discovered that they differ by only one hydroxyl group. That's just one hydrogen atom and one oxygen atom. Estrogen and testosterone are basically fraternal twins in different clothing. Secondly, when estrogen was finally isolated from horse urine, it came not from females, but from excretions of stallions. Scientists had assumed that ovaries make estrogen and testicles make testosterone. This discovery prompted scientists to realize that both make both. And lastly, investigators had thought that estrogen and testosterone were antagonistic chemicals. Like kids on a seesaw, the rise of one pushed the other down. But really, the two chemicals are not antagonists at all, but partners that often work in cahoots. These findings ushered in a more complicated view of hormones. Scientists were no longer studying one at a time, but examining how they were connected. The second half of the 20th century began with triumph. Scientists figured out how to measure hormones, something that had been considered impossible. That's because, despite their power, hormones come in tiny packets. They had been considered too scarce to measure. Shortly thereafter, the birth control pill was approved. A take-home speedy pregnancy test replaced older, slower methods, and bottled hormones were sold to quash the symptoms of menopause. But the glee didn't last long. As hormone drugs became hugely popular, side effects began to emerge. The original dose of the pill was linked to deadly strokes. Hormone replacement therapy, once assumed to prevent all kinds of chronic ailments of old age, was found to be effective, but not the wonder cure it had been touted to be. Today, we are taking a more discerning approach to hormone therapies, but much remains to be known. How do we weigh benefits with potential risks? The point is not to promote a new way to stay young forever. That's an old story, and one that continues to be rewritten. Nor is it to promote all things natural. We are made of hormones, after all. They are our natural chemistry. Rather, Aroused helps to appreciate the complex interactions that hormones have with each other within our bodies, and the relationships we have with hormones to which we are exposed. It was only recently that my mother told me that, in the weeks leading up to Grandma Martha's diagnosis, the card-playing ladies said that my grandmother was unusually exhausted. She'd fall asleep during games. Then, on the Monday before Thanksgiving in 1974, she showed up at our house in New Jersey and sat there calmly. Instead of dipping a spoon into the soup, crinkling her nose, and muttering under her breath that it needed more salt, she rested on a couch. This was not the Grandma Martha we knew. Salt craving, we would soon learn, was another sign of Addison's disease. There was no Grandma Martha gossiping, no complaining. She didn't even have the energy to go out onto the back porch and smoke a cigarette. My mother got scared and called the doctor. He couldn't find anything wrong, but given the odd personality change, he admitted my grandmother to the hospital for extra tests. By the time my grandmother was wheeled to her assigned bed, she was too weak to lift a fork, so my mother had to feed her. That's when my mother noticed that my grandmother's tongue was pitch black. In retrospect, my mother isn't sure if the internist ever examined her. How did he miss the symptoms? My father, a pathologist, put the clues together. Black tongue, bronzed skin, extreme fatigue, and suspected Addison's disease. He insisted on hormone testing. It revealed a dearth of cortisol. Back then, I didn't know much about her disease, except that John F. Kennedy had the same thing, which made it sound like a very presidential thing to catch. My memory throughout my childhood is my mother saying, "Ma, don't forget to take your cortisone pill." There was one pill in the morning and one in the afternoon. I'm not even sure I knew Addison's was a hormone disease. To me, hormones were boobs and periods and sex. Simple enough. But hormones are so much more. They are potent chemicals that control metabolism, behavior, sleep, mood swings, the immune system, fighting, fleeing, not just puberty and sex. So in a sense, this is a story of the biochemistry of living, breathing, emotional beings. The history of hormones is also a story of discovery, wrong turns, persistence, and hope. Taking both together, the basic science and the people who shaped it, Aroused is a tale of what makes us human from the inside out. 1. The Fat Bride. Not even a day had passed since the fat bride was dead and buried before the body snatchers tried to dig her up and cart her off to scientists. The first attempted exhumation occurred around midnight on October 27, 1883, at Baltimore's Mount Olivet Cemetery. The cemetery's night watchman fired his gun, startling the vandals, who fled with their spades and shovels. An hour later, gunshots sent another group running from the same grave. Newspapers offered conflicting stories. Some said bullets pierced 2 grave robbers. Others said no one was hurt. In any event, everyone survived. Except, of course, the bride. It's a wonder anyone thought they could exhume all 517 pounds of Blanche Gray, a.k.a. the Fat Bride. For starters, it had taken a dozen burly men to strap her body to a wooden plank, carry her down 3 flights of stairs, lift her onto the undertaker's wagon, and plant her 6 feet under. It would require at least that many men to hoist her up. Secondly, her body was a coveted medical commodity, so the guard was particularly vigilant that night, maintaining a lookout from the second-floor window of his house on the cemetery grounds, within viewing distance of the plot. A co-worker helped. Together they took turns staring out the window with their guns in ready position. Poor Blanche Gray. She was born in Detroit, a huge baby, a 12-pounder, who ballooned to 250 pounds by the time she turned 12. Her mother had died a few days after her birth. Her father and 2 brothers figured no one would marry her, and she'd be stuck at home forever. Gray thought otherwise. She was determined to get as far away as possible, to start a new life for herself that was under neither the critical gawk of her family nor the curious gaze of doctors. She chose a profession that put her in the spotlight anyhow. At 17, Gray boarded a bus and headed to Manhattan to get a job in a freak show. She reckoned she could get a fat lady gig, sitting alongside the other abnormals, the bearded ladies, the midgets, the giants, and the rest of them. Sometimes they arranged themselves in a cavernous room. Sometimes they were shoved behind an amusement park's roller coaster. Savvy entrepreneurs promoted these voyeuristic shows as educational entertainment. The display of so much human variation crammed into one place didn't just amuse a prurient public. It stoked the curiosity of an eclectic crew of physiologists, neuroscientists, and biochemists. They aimed to prove that these folks were the way they were because of a physical defect, not because of a moral failing or divine punishment, as was generally thought. If they could figure out what made these folks dangerously different, they just might discover what made the rest of us so wonderfully normal. If Gray had been born 100 years later, living in the second half of the 20th century instead of the 19th century, doctors might have tested her for various hormone defects linked to obesity. Problems, perhaps, with the levels of thyroid and growth hormones. If she had been born closer to 2000, there's a good chance she would have seen endocrinologists who might have analyzed her levels of leptin and ghrelin. The doctors who examined her at birth might have suspected that her mother suffered from diabetes, a hormone disease that, among other things, increases the odds of having an obese baby. They would have known enough about hormone problems to check for other conditions, too. Untreated thyroid deficiencies at birth, for instance, lead not only to weight gain, but also to cognitive deficiencies and dry skin. But Gray lived on the wrong side of scientific discovery. There were hints. 40 years before Gray's death, in 1840, an autopsy of a woman dead from so-called fatal obesity revealed a tumor encroaching on a brain gland. Not long after that, the corpse of an obese, developmentally delayed 10-year-old was found to lack a throat gland. Had a gland disease killed Gray? Almost as soon as Gray arrived in New York City, she was earning $25 a week as a fat lady in a museum at 210 Bowery. The museum would become the Monroe Hotel for Skid Row bums in the 1930s, and then a luxury high-rise in 2012. Just as quickly, she caught the eye of David Moses, the ticket taker, who pulled in a relatively meager $5 weekly salary. After a few dates, he proposed to become her husband and manager. She said yes to both. She was 17, but said she was 18. He was 25. Moses sold tickets to their wedding at New York City's Dime Museum. A huge banner flapped across the entrance. Blanche Gray, the fattest girl in the world, will be married on stage tonight at 9 p.m. Moses placed articles in local newspapers to ensure a sold-out audience. The advertisements hailed Blanche as the wonder of the 19th century. A ponderous bride, said the Baltimore Sun. More than a better half, said the New York Times. Blanche Gray tipped the scales at 517 pounds, so it was only natural, therefore, and in accordance with the laws of gravitation, that the smaller body should be attracted by the larger. The Times called her an adipose monstrosity. Right after the ceremony, Moses had another proposition: to switch Gray's stage name from Fat Lady to Fat Bride. He said it would give her an advantage in an increasingly crowded field. Fat girls and ladies, after all, were generic. Fat brides were rare. Moses guaranteed exhibitors swarms of paying gawkers because Blanche's betrothal and wedding had been such a media sensation. He scored a slew of bookings for their working honeymoon. The morning after the reception, the new Mrs. Moses had a performance at New York City's bustling Coney Island boardwalk. From there, her husband booked Baltimore's Dime Museum and then Philadelphia's Hager and Campbell Casino. At first, everything seemed to be going stupendously well. The Dime Museum in Baltimore threw in free rooms at a boarding house, not just for the newlyweds, but for their wedding attendants as well. The armless dwarf, the bearded lady, and the white Moor. The locals called it the Freaks Boarding House. The only almost glitch was their honeymoon suite. Blanche had trouble managing the ascent to the third floor. The museum agreed to pulley her up, with the help of men and a crane. Moses suggested they sell tickets for her vertical voyage. Within days, there were ominous signs. Audiences complained that the fat bride had trouble keeping her eyes open. The bearded lady worried because Blanche's skin looked blotchy and purple. Her husband would later say that he kept an eye on her, but never realized how sick she was. Despite outward appearances, the Baltimore Sun reported that Blanche was jolly and happy, and even encouraged the eye-winking of the living skeleton at the museum, much to the dislike of her husband, who grew jealous. A few days later, she died. Moses was stunned. He had slept through the night, waking up around 7 o'clock because his wife rolled over. She was breathing heavily, so he kissed her and went back to sleep. An hour later, he was startled by a knock at the door. It was the manager. Before he got up, he said, he stopped to look at his wife and realized she was dead. Her death made headlines, as her wedding had done. "The fattest of brides, dead," reported the Baltimore Sun. "Her fat killed her," headlined the Chicago Daily Tribune. Her death was even covered in the Irish Times. Sudden death of a fat woman. Crowds gathered as Gray was hauled to the cemetery. Women returning home from shopping dropped their baskets and stared. Young girls pushed through the throng for front-row viewing. Boys climbed telegraph poles. Neighbors leaned out of windows. As they watched the obese woman being carted from the Freaks Hotel, they got a free peek at the tearful one-armed woman, the bearded lady, and the other circus folk who walked alongside her. The crowd on the pavement seemed to regard the grief of the poor dead woman's friends as a show to be stared at, the Baltimore Sun reported. They laughed and nudged each other. Gray's tragic tale epitomizes Gilded Age America. Freak shows, a disdain for the abnormal, yet capitalizing on them, and a sensationalist press. Reportedly, Moses tried to profit from Gray's death, selling photos of her dead body for a dime apiece. Despite a spate of articles that seemed more parable than journalism, no one bothered to say that Gray's death was just like her life, a media brouhaha that took little account of her as a person. She was, it seemed, a gimmick for the press and a meddlesome public. But Blanche's story is more than a tale of fleeting fame and minimal fortune. It cast a spotlight on late 19th century medicine. Blanche died at the very moment scientists were beginning to unravel the mysteries of our endocrine system, the secretions from internal organs, our hormones. Why were some folks too fat, too hairy, too big, too small? The discovery of hormones, just a few years after her burial, would lead to answers. And in time, understanding hormones would lead to life-saving treatments, such as insulin for diabetes. The research would also help us decode the chemical basis of so much about what makes us, us. Not just our physical development, but our psychic development too. What triggers anger? What prompts maternal bonding? Can our internal chemistry explain hate or love or lust? Perhaps no other field of medicine tackles so vast a territory as endocrinology, the study of hormones. Chemically speaking, hormones are loopy chains of amino acids, or rings of carbon atoms with dangly bits hanging off the sides. But thinking about them in terms of design only is like describing football as an elliptical leather mass being tossed around a 100-yard-long rectangle. It doesn't express how one relatively small mass ignites such awesome power and complexity. If you consider your body a vast information highway, a collection of messages being sent this way and that, your nervous system works like an old-fashioned operator's switchboard. It contains wires that need to be plugged into the source and the target in order to transmit signals. You can follow the path of a nerve from one end to the other. Hormones are a different story altogether. The remarkable thing about them, as opposed to all the other substances in your body, is the seemingly magical way they work. Hormones are pinballed from one cell in one part of the body and reach faraway targets, no connections needed. They are your wireless network. A brain cell, for instance, emits a hormone, just one droplet, and ignites a response in the testes or ovaries. Other chemicals journey far, such as oxygen, which also travels in the blood. But oxygen isn't released from a gland headed to a specific target, as hormones are. The 9 key glands in the body, from head to genitals, are the hypothalamus, pineal, and pituitary in the brain, the thyroid and neighboring parathyroids in the throat, the islets of Langerhans in the pancreas, the adrenals capping the kidneys, and the ovaries and testes. Scientists would discover in the early 1900s that when they removed a hormone-making gland from a dog's brain, they could inject its juices anywhere else in the body, and everything would return to normal. Astonishing, really. Scientists would also learn that every one of our cells has markers, like routers for computers, that direct hormone signals precisely where they need to go. They would also realize that hormones rarely work alone. A dip in the amount of one hormone interferes with other hormones, and like falling dominoes, throws a host of bodily functions off kilter. All of these emissions from hormone-making glands are in some aspects different, but the same. Related, like siblings, or maybe more like cousins. The job of the gland is simple, to secrete hormones. The job of the hormone is trickier, to keep the body balanced. Hormones control growth, metabolism, behavior, sleep, lactation, stress, mood swings, sleep-wake cycles, the immune system, mating, fighting, fleeing, puberty, parenting, and sex. They aim to get us back to normal when things are out of whack. And they can be the cause of commotion, too. Endocrinology did not emerge until the 19th century, long after other substantial medical discoveries. By the end of the 17th century, scientists had recognized that the blood circulates rather than swishes back and forth, and they had a pretty good picture of human anatomy. The discovery of hormones was delayed until the birth of physiology and chemistry in the mid-1800s, which created a new way to study the body. No longer did investigators approach the body simply by exploring the terrain, like map-makers venturing onto new land, nor did they limit their focus to examining the roots of blood and nerves. They began to tinker with the body's chemical substances and theorize about their impact on health and disease. Medicine became more scientific. In 1894, William Osler, considered the father of modern medicine, declared that the physician without physiology.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?